This is the standard timeline of Western history. We start at the peak of the Roman Empire, a society defined by complex law and engineering. But then we see a precipitous decline. For nearly a millennium, the data points drop into a deep valley known as the Dark Ages, before a sudden spike upward marks the Renaissance. We are taught that during this 1,000-year gap, the mechanics of civilization simply stalled. Record-keeping, art, and high technology seem to vanish overnight. For the traditional narrative to be true, progress didn't just slow down, it essentially hit a wall and stayed there for 10 centuries. Consider Roman architecture. They mastered a specialized watertight concrete that allowed for massive domes and aqueducts. After the 5th century, that chemical knowledge disappears from the record, only to reappear identically during the Renaissance, re-emerging with the same composition after a 1,000-year sleep. We see the same friction in art. In the 14th century, artists depicting ancient Roman battles frequently showed soldiers in steel plate armor and using medieval siege tactics. While mainstream history calls this an artistic error, it raises the question of whether these painters were actually depicting their own recent history. Then there is the lack of physical evidence. Authentic, contemporary primary sources from the 5th to the 10th centuries are virtually non-existent. Our knowledge of this entire era relies on copies of texts produced hundreds of years later, often by medieval monks whose own records are the only proof the era happened at all. These anomalies have led a group of researchers to a radical conclusion. They argue that humanity didn't lose its technology or its literacy. Instead, they believe those empty centuries never occurred. Accepting the standard narrative requires us to ignore the basic rules of logical progression. If the data doesn't fit the timeline, the problem might not be the data. It might be the timeline itself. To find the error, mathematician Anatoly Fomenko stopped looking at history as a story and started looking at it as raw data. He took the biographies of kings and emperors and converted their life events into measurable statistical profiles. Fomenko mapped the reign lengths and key events of major rulers into scatterplots, generating unique biographical curves. Comparing these across centuries revealed a recurring pattern. The profiles of ancient Roman emperors and medieval kings overlap perfectly. In pure data, their biographies are identical. This led to the theory of chronological duplication. It suggests that iconic figures like Julius Caesar might be fictitious composites, built by taking the real-life biographies of later medieval rulers and projecting them centuries into the past. This likely happened as a clerical error. Medieval mercenaries returning from the East brought back accounts of their exploits. When these stories were later transcribed by monks in the West, the scribes misinterpreted the events as local ancient history rather than contemporary foreign news. If the math is correct, much of our ancient record is a statistical mirage. We aren't looking at the dawn of civilization. We are looking at medieval data mirrored into a void created by a broken calendar. Other researchers, including Heribert Illig and Gunnar Heinsohn, reached the same conclusion through archaeology. They argued the only way to fix the historical record was to physically delete centuries of phantom time from the calendar. Look at this cross-section of history. When you remove the empty Dark Age strata, the Renaissance layer above it drops down and snaps on to the Roman layer below. The evolutionary leap from Roman concrete to Renaissance domes is no longer a mystery. Without the 1,000-year interruption, the transition from antiquity to the High Middle Ages follows a clear, logical progression in technology, art, and language. This raises a new question. If these centuries were invented, who stood to gain? The evidence points toward 14th century Italy. The primary suspects are the medieval papacy and Renaissance humanists like Petrarch. These were men who spent their lives discovering long-lost classical texts that conveniently supported their own contemporary political goals. At the time, Rome faced a legitimacy crisis. The true cultural and economic superpower was Constantinople in the East. To claim supremacy, Roman elites needed a pedigree that predated their rivals, an ancient origin story placing Italy at the center of human history. This carved text shows the rigid, uniform structure of Latin, a language that defies the messy, irregular evolution of natural speech. Rather than a tongue that grew organically, Latin appears to be a highly engineered administrative tool. It is a language of law and theology, perfectly suited for forging the primary documents needed to simulate an ancient Roman pedigree. By establishing this artificial history, medieval elites could claim they weren't just local rulers, but the rightful heirs to a 1,000-year-old empire. The ancient Rome we study today was likely a retroactive branding exercise designed to legitimize medieval power. Mainstream historians argue that modern science makes this kind of fraud impossible. They point to radiometric dating and tree ring analysis as the ultimate proof that our current timeline is accurate. This graph illustrates the flaw in that logic. Raw dating data is often imprecise. To make it usable, scientists frequently force the results into calibration models that are already based on the existing historical calendar. The science isn't proving the history, it is being adjusted to fit it. Without objective, independent confirmation, our understanding of the past is incredibly fragile. It relies on a narrow chain of documents that were hand-copied, were carefully curated, and occasionally invented by the very people who benefited from the narrative. We treat our chronological map as a law of nature. But dates like 800 AD are human inventions, filing systems created long after the fact. If the map is wrong, the entire geography of our civilization changes. Questioning the calendar is a destabilizing exercise. It forces us to admit that our past is more propaganda than fact. But identifying those errors is the only way to move beyond a manufactured history and see the reality of the human story.